July 1863, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. As the fate of a nation hung in the balance, Union and Confederate soldiers faced not only each other, but an unseen enemy that drained their strength with every passing hour.
We think the heat index at the peak of the battle was around 100.
The scorching heat and stifling humidity of those 3 fateful days may have played a bigger role in shaping history than we realized.
So you've got dehydration, exhaustion, they're not eating properly, poor sanitation, and they're carrying tens of pounds of equipment.
This week we are going off the radar and diving into the sweltering conditions at the Battle of Gettysburg with Dr. Jon Nese of Penn State University. Using forensic analysis and modern meteorological concepts, Dr. Nese is uncovering new insights into how weather influenced this pivotal week in American history.
Heat index doesn't take into account any of those things, and it also doesn't take into account were you in the sun.
And why looking back in time may shed new light on understanding history.
When you include the weather piece in a historical event, it may allow the way the history is thought of to be thought of in a new way.
I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much, much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Off the Radar. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, your host, producer, editor of this podcast. Thanks for listening, and thanks to all of our new listeners over the past several weeks. Today's episode is all about American history, specifically the Battle of Gettysburg. So I got this idea for this episode when I went to the AMS meeting in Baltimore in January, and I saw Dr. Jon Nese, who's a professor at Penn State University, giving this talk about wet bulb globe temperatures and the Battle of Gettysburg. And he's done some forensic analysis here to figure out exactly what conditions were like those few days back in 1863. And as we are on the anniversary of that time period, I thought this would be a great week to dive into this. So thanks to Dr. Jon Nese for being on the show today. I used to work with Dr. Nese many years ago when he was on the Weather Channel, and I was a weather producer for him. So thanks for listening today. A shout out to my son, whose birthday is this week, July 4th, my little 4th of July baby. Aaron, happy birthday. Happy 11th birthday. Make sure you check out our hurricane special on YouTube. We're also running it on our National Weather Desk show this week on July 4th. And then we're also running our wildfire special on the 5th. So make sure you tune in for both of those. A little heads up, there will be no new podcast next week, July 9th. We are taking the week off for vacation, and we'll be back on the 16th, and some great episodes coming up at the end of the month and early next month as well. So enjoy my chat about Gettysburg with Dr. Jon Nese from Penn State University. Dr. Jon Nese, it's so good to see you. I haven't seen you in 20 years. Back a long, long time ago when we both worked at the Weather Channel and you worked mornings and I was kind of frantically making graphics trying to live up to your expectations.
Oh, sorry. I don't remember much of the 6 a.m. mornings, but thank you.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. But now you're kind of back in your element of teaching, and I saw a very cool presentation when I was at AMS in Baltimore this year. And I do like history, and I like kind of this forensics of unfolding old historical events and then working in the weather element. And that's exactly what you did at the meeting. So I've been dying to talk to you about this, and we're coming up kind of on that time of year when this happened. So I want to talk about Gettysburg, and I want to get a little background on you too, for people who maybe don't remember you were on the Weather Channel or didn't have you as a professor, because I feel like you've had just so many students at this point. Can you tell me where you are, what you're doing now?
Yeah, I'm on the faculty at Penn State. I oversee the undergraduate program. I teach 2 classes every semester. I don't teach during the summer, but I run some weather camps during the summer. In fact, there's one next week for adults who want to learn a little bit about the weather. And then I still do some television. Penn State has a long-running 15-minute weekday weather show that is distributed across all of Pennsylvania. It's called Weather World. I'm wearing the shirt today, and I'm on that show 2 or 3 times a week. So it's a blessing to be able to do all these different parts of meteorology, and I still love my job.
So let's talk about Gettysburg and go way back to 1863. Can you refresh for people who maybe aren't great with their American history exactly what happened in 1863 during the Battle of Gettysburg?
Yeah, the battle was fought July 1 through 3, 1863, in Gettysburg, a small community in south central Pennsylvania, not far from the Maryland border. The research I'm working on actually focuses on the entire Gettysburg campaign, which most historians argue began around June 3rd, when most of the armies were near Fredericksburg, Virginia. And then they eventually moved north, fought the battle, and then it took Lee's army about 10 days to get out of Pennsylvania, recross the Potomac. So the so-called Gettysburg campaign is generally considered to end around June 15th. So it's that whole period that we're trying to look at a little more carefully than has been done in the past.
Okay, and we have like tons of weather information coming at us from all angles in 2024, but in 1863, what kind of weather measurements were being taken?
So the Smithsonian Institute had a network of weather observers that was rather coarse compared to, as you say, what we do today. But there actually was an observer in Gettysburg, a professor at Gettysburg College, though it wasn't called that then. I think it was called Pennsylvania College then. So there was actually an observer in Gettysburg observing the weather 3 times a day, which certainly helps. There were observers in Harrisburg up the road, about 30 miles. There was an observer in Frederick, Maryland, though that observer stopped observing in July, which has really kind of been a disappointment. There were observers in Washington, D.C., Annapolis, Maryland. Most of Virginia, though, no observers during the Civil War. A lot of the observing systems just shut down. I mean, for obvious reasons. So we also have informal observations from the soldiers. My colleague, Jeff Harding, who is really started this research, has compiled like a 400-page Word document of all the quotes he can find from soldiers as they made their way to Gettysburg and then made their way back. But of course, as you know, Emily, some weather observations are more reliable than others. And so reading through some of the soldiers' observations, there were days when one soldier said it rained the whole day and the other soldier, supposedly 30 miles away, said it was a pleasant day. So it's kind of, as you said earlier, this forensic meteorology, it's interesting and it's challenging. And but yeah, that's it. I mean, as you know, no satellites, no radar, none of this. I will add, though, that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as you know, Emily, has developed a lot of products where you try to reconstruct what the weather did look like. And so, believe it or not, there are actually maps you can draw on the internet giving the best guess at what the surface pressure map, for example, looked like during those days. And I've been drawing those maps and trying to analyze them, but you kind of got to take it with a grain of salt because you're building this picture of the atmosphere from scanty observations. So it's like, you know what the pressure was in Pittsburgh, you know what it was in Charleston, South Carolina, you know what it was in Washington, D.C., and maybe like New York, in Gettysburg, and then you try to build, you try to guess at what the actual weather map looked like.
Interesting. I love that you picked Charleston because that's where I am right now.
You're in Charleston, South Carolina.
Yeah, that's where I live.
Well, the weather observations there in the 1860s were really good.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Charleston is considered kind of a bedrock location when it comes to observations, even during the Civil War.
Oh, okay, cool.
I could share those observations with you.
Yes, I would love that. Okay,
if you can read the writing.
Yes, that's got to be tough.
That's the other part. My eyes get sore.
Right. Did you have to bring in like somebody who specializes in handwriting at all to look at that?
That's a great question. I have not done that. Maybe I should. Usually what I do is I walk upstairs and I say to some of my colleagues, could you look at this and tell me what you think this is? And then usually we come to a conclusion, oh, that's how he wrote an N for North. Or that's how she did her nines.
Yes. Interesting. Okay. So before you started this research, what was kind of the general idea of what weather was like during the battle?
Well, American weather historian David Ludlum wrote a paper for an article in WeatherWise magazine in 1960, 65 years ago or so, about the weather during the battle. And he had at his disposal most of what we now have, although we found some other stuff that he didn't have. So the general idea was it didn't really rain. There were no widespread rains during the 3 days of battle, although some of the soldiers' accounts suggest that it did rain, and we're still working on that. So it was warm and it was humid. The peak heat during the 3-day battle took place on the afternoon of July 3rd. Many people who know a little bit about history have probably heard of Pickett's Charge as being sort of a culminating battle on the afternoon of July 3rd. We know that the temperature was around 90, and some of the new work that we've done recently have estimated the dew point was in the mid-70s. Now, for those who aren't familiar with dew point, it's a way we meteorologists convey discomfort. And once the dew point gets to that 75, as you know, that's pretty uncomfortable. That's kind of like South Florida in summer. And so we think the heat index at the peak of the battle, and this is sort of the new work that we did that no one had ever estimated before, was around 100 during the peak of the afternoon on July 3rd. And that would have been the most uncomfortable part of the battle.
And just for reference, that part of Pennsylvania, that time of year, what might like a typical afternoon high be?
Right. Yeah, good question. Typical high might be modern day, 85 for the peak heat. The thing about these observations, though, in most cases, we don't actually know what the high temperature was. These observers observed 3 times a day, 7 a.m., 2 p.m., 9 p.m. So we have a 2 p.m. temperature measurement of 88. But as you know, it's summer, it's July 3rd. If it's 88 at 2 p.m., it could be 90 something at 5 o'clock. It all depends on the clouds. And so it gets complicated. But the short answer to your question is mid 80s.
Okay. And you were talking about, kind of differing accounts when it comes to precipitation. Is it possible there was like a rogue thunderstorm?
Yeah.
Is that something you're looking into?
Absolutely. And the truth is, I'm not up to the analysis yet of I started on June 3rd, and I have the armies almost to Gettysburg, and I have not read all of the quotes yet from July 1st, 2nd, or 3rd. I thought that would be sort of the coup de grace, sort of the. But no, absolutely. I'm convinced. In fact, one soldier writes about seeing a rainbow on July 1st in Gettysburg. Well, you know darn well unless they were dehydrated and imagining things, which is not, when you read these accounts, my goodness, the weather, of course, is one problem, but dehydration, lack of proper sanitation. These guys, and the soldiers were, essentially all men. They've just walked, some of them, 30 miles in 24 hours to get to Gettysburg once the battle started. So you've got dehydration, exhaustion. They're not eating properly, poor sanitation, and they're carrying tens of pounds of equipment. So, the weather, you might say, 90 degrees, heat index of 100, that's not good, but it could be worse. And absolutely it could be worse. But, heat index doesn't take into account any of those things. And it also doesn't take into account, were you in the sun?
Sure. So what were they wearing?
Well, my partner, Jeff Harding, is the expert here, but these were wool uniforms generally. But when you read their accounts of their marching, some of them would they would take their uniforms off. They couldn't stand it. Or, they had a hat and they would take a towel, dump the towel in a creek, throw the towel on their head, put their hat on, and then try to march like that. So, the marching, some of these stories, and I would encourage anybody who cares about the history of our country and how we got where we are, you got to read some of the stories of these soldiers and what they went through, and the amount of marching they had to do. And so weather's just a part of the puzzle, but it's the part I'm most interested in.
Yeah. Okay. And you hinted at this a second ago about not taking into account the sun. Enter wet bulb globe temperature. A term that a lot of people I don't even really know what it means or have even maybe heard of it. So can you take me through that?
Yeah, so we're going to also present some results about that. The wet bulb globe temperature, simply stated, is a way to quantify the combination of heat, humidity, and sunshine, because it allows you to incorporate how much sun there is and the angle of the sun. It also takes into account wind. So it does two things that the heat index doesn't include. It includes sunshine and it includes wind. Which, listeners might say, well, why don't more people use this? It sounds like a more realistic measure. And I think the reason more people don't use it, I'd be interested in what you think, is that the numbers that the wet bulb globe temperature presents aren't as high as the numbers that the heat index presents, because wet bulb globe temperature is on sort of a different scale. And so the numbers aren't as scary.
Right. It's definitely like a less sexy term.
That's right. That's right. And it's harder to say.
It is. Yes, it is.
So like a wet bulb globe temperature of 90, is very bad. But people are so indoctrinated to the heat index.
Yeah.
Which, the heat index needs to be 100 before people pay attention. And I think that's why it hasn't caught on, quite frankly, because the numbers aren't as threatening.
Do you think the Weather Service may start using it more when it comes to issuing advisories or warnings about heat? Because right now, in their terminology, they use heat index a lot. I think that's where people are like, okay, if it's going to be over 100 or over 105, that's our criteria.
Certainly in a perfect world where we wanted to get it right and provide the most efficient information, you just scrap heat index. You start using wet bulb globe temperature, and you make sure the public understands how to interpret it. But as you know, having been in television, it took a while for television people to even talk about dew point on TV because it was too complicated for people.
We got there though, so maybe it just takes time.
It took time. You have to have the table ready to explain what the numbers mean. But no, you're absolutely right. If you want to do it right, not that there's not more than one way to do it right, but if you want to give the public the best possible information, then the wet bulb globe temperature is the way to go. And as you know, the military's been using it for decades. And shucks, down in Georgia and Florida, I'm at least aware that sports teams, high school sports teams, whether or not you practice outdoors, is dependent on the wet bulb globe temperature. I know here at Penn State, I collaborate with the football team, and the medical staff is very, very aware of the wet bulb globe temperature.
How do you measure the wet bulb globe temperature?
Well, there is an instrument that you use where a thermometer is placed inside of a globe. And so that globe absorbs sunlight, and therefore the number that the thermometer is reading would incorporate the idea of sunshine. And then you also need to measure the humidity, so you need a measurement of dew point. And then there's a formula for it and a table to get the wet bulb globe temperature. There's at least one online calculator where you tell it where you are, so it can calculate the angle of the sun. So you need the latitude, and you need to know how sunny it is, how much cloudiness there is, and it'll do the calculation for you.
Are they pretty widely spread across the country, or is it like a network that's kind of building?
The Weather Service probably has a wet bulb globe temperature map so someone's doing the calculation for us in the background. But if you're doing forensic work, like I am, then where the Weather Service isn't working for me and I need to do it myself, there is a calculator online that I think OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, has, where you can type the numbers in and do it forensically.
Okay. So you, I'm guessing there were temperatures coming out of this time, but how did you get humidity from this time?
This was the tricky part because the gentleman who was observing at Gettysburg did not provide a measurement of humidity. There's the old-fashioned observation sheets that these people were using in the 1860s, provided by the Smithsonian Institution, had a column for humidity, but his was blank.
How did they even measure humidity back then? Like if there was a column, how were they?
Well, they used a sling psychrometer, which I guess I should explain for your listeners, is a device that has two thermometers. One is a regular thermometer, and the other thermometer has a piece of cloth over the bulb of the thermometer. And you wet the cloth. And so the water on that cloth evaporates, and evaporation is actually a cooling process. Think about when you step out of a pool, you feel a chill. That's because water is evaporating off your skin. It's stealing energy from your body, so you feel cooler. Well, the same thing happens on that thermometer with the cloth on the bulb. It's called the wet bulb thermometer for obvious reasons. Water evaporates from the cloth, and therefore the temperature on that thermometer will be lower than the temperature on the regular thermometer. And by knowing the difference between the temperature on the thermometer, the regular thermometer, and the wet bulb thermometer, you can perform a calculation and figure out the relative humidity and the dew point, which is really the number we want. We want the dew point because if you know the dew point, you have a measure of human comfort. So what we did is, fortunately, the observers up the road in Harrisburg, and there were two of them, did measure the wet bulb temperature. So we were able to compute dew points in Harrisburg and then argue that the two communities, Gettysburg and Harrisburg, are so close in certain weather regimes. Like if sometimes there could be a front between them, but in the weather regime that dominated the Battle of Gettysburg, it's reasonable to assume that the conditions of humidity in Harrisburg were similar to those of Gettysburg. And we also have data from Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia that corroborate that. In other words, stated simplistically, fighting the battle in Gettysburg, the way it felt weather-wise, would have been essentially equivalent had they fought the battle in Harrisburg. That's basically what it comes down to.
All right. So you've got temperature, you've got your dew point humidity, and then you kind of did your calculations from there. And you said around 90 is what you're thinking the wet bulb globe temperature was during the battle?
We're in the upper 80s to around 90. And I think that's a conservative estimate because, again, we don't know the exact temperature at the peak of the battle. The only sunshine information we have is an observation at 2:00 in the afternoon where the observer in Gettysburg said that the sky was 40% covered by cloud. But there are other factors going on here, like, the battle, like if you've ever been to Harrisburg or to Gettysburg, as I have a couple times, and you can climb a tower and look down right where Pickett's charge took place and imagine what it looked like. This was a field. There were plants growing in this field. And of course, plants transpire. And so who knows what the true dew point was in the middle of that field. And so I do think we're being rather conservative in terms of our estimates because the temperature could have been in the 90s. We'll never know for certain. Nobody had a thermometer out in the middle of that field. I mean, the bottom line is that the conditions under which the battle was fought on the afternoon of July 3rd, at the conservative estimate of the values of the wet bulb globe temperature that we believe were present during the peak of the battle on July 3rd, the effects on the human body are working or exercising in direct sunlight will stress your body after 20 minutes, take at least 40 minutes of breaks each hour if working or exercising in direct sunlight. Yeah, I don't think that was happening on the afternoon of July 3rd. And again, some of these soldiers, as my colleague Jeff Harding will tell you, they just marched a long way to get to Gettysburg. They're not being properly fed. That's just an example of the conditions under which we think the battle was fought on that third day. One other point we make is that during that entire 3-day period, we don't think the temperature in Gettysburg dropped below 70 degrees. So think about this in modern day. Yeah, of course, we have air conditioning, so you're like, well, whoop-de-doo. But they're outside. The temperature never drops below 70 at night. And it's humid. I mean, you have no time to recover at night.
So you said your research is kind of ongoing. What else are you working on?
We're under contract to submit a manuscript for a book on the weather of the whole Gettysburg campaign. So from June 3rd to July 15th, which is approximately when the last Confederate soldiers crossed the Potomac River to get back into Virginia, trying to, get out before Meade's army destroys them. And obviously they did, because the war lasted a couple more years. But never again would the Confederates get into Union territory like they did there. That was it. They were, they got as far north as about Harrisburg. There were some troops in Harrisburg, the state capital, but they never got any farther north as far as I know.
Were there any other kind of noteworthy weather moments during that time?
Well, there was a terrible heat wave from about the 15th to 18th of June as the soldiers were progressing through Virginia. And you should read some of their accounts. I mean, forced marches, direct sunshine, hasn't rained for 3 weeks. So the heat wave that lasted from about the 15th to the 18th of June is a very noteworthy weather event. In addition, after the battle, as Lee and his armies tried to retreat back into Maryland, it rained a lot. I mean, I mentioned earlier these reconstruction maps that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has online, where you can sort of get the best guess of what the weather map looked like. It looks to me like a cold front was approaching southern Pennsylvania on around the 4th of July. And it kind of stalled along the Mason-Dixon line, which, as a meteorologist, that's what happens in summer. These fronts don't make it to Atlanta, Georgia. They don't make it to Charleston, South Carolina. They don't even make it into North Carolina.
We have the same weather every day.
Yeah, so this front stalls, and it looked like a series of thunderstorm pulses. And the bottom line is, it rained a lot during the retreat from Gettysburg. And this made it very difficult for the Confederates to retreat. And so that would be the other noteworthy weather event during the Gettysburg campaign, was the persistent heavy rains during the retreat, and the Potomac River rose too high for them to get across. And that meant that Lee's army was trapped on the Union side of the Potomac for several days.
Other than the obvious of it's super cool, why else do you think it's important to reconstruct historical events and look at the weather?
Well, I think when you include the weather piece in a historical event, it may allow the way the history is thought of to be thought of in a new way. I mean, there's a lot of events, not just military events, that have been affected by weather. I mean, the Challenger disaster comes to mind immediately, something that I've also looked at very carefully, though not uniquely. A lot of people have done that. But the effect of the brutal winters on the Eastern Front of World War II, for example, is another example. This is also around this time of year, the 80th anniversary of D-Day this year. The invasion, the landing at Normandy was delayed a day. And Eisenhower is quoted as saying after the war that, I'm paraphrasing here, that one of the reasons we won the war in that invasion was successful was because we had better meteorologists than the Germans. And it really is true. The Allies had control of the North Atlantic approaching D-Day, so the Germans really didn't have any weather information from that part of the world. And of course, as you know, weather moves west to east. And so finding that window for the invasion on June 6th, and the Germans didn't think the Allies would do it. So I think weather, short answer, that was the long answer. The short answer is that weather helps us sometimes put a different perspective on why history ended up the way it did. And in that way, I think it's a useful contribution.
For sure. You mentioned a couple there. Are there any other events that you think down the road you'll dive into, maybe lesser known ones?
Oh, geez.
Got a long list.
No, I think the plan for next summer is already in place. Shameless plug for my introductory weather textbook, which is in its 6th edition. It needs an update. So I may be working on the 7th edition of my meteorology textbook next summer. So no, I have not thought about the next historical event. Just get me through this summer, please.
Jon, is there anything else you want to add about Gettysburg or the work you've been doing?
Simply that if you haven't been there or haven't been to Gettysburg in a long time, I think it's worth a revisit. Certainly opened my eyes. I hadn't been there since I was 9 years old. My dad was a high school history teacher. He took us there when I was a little kid. And until last year, I hadn't been back. But then appreciating what these folks went through. Just if you read enough of these quotes, you're going to come away with the conclusion that no matter when it's fought and what it's fought with, war is hell. And, sometimes it's just not clear to me why we keep doing it. I know that's off track. I'm not a historian, nor am I a philosopher, but if you read some of what the soldiers went through during this campaign, you will look at war and American history in a different way. The last thought is thanks for giving this opportunity to reconnect with you and to talk a little bit about this work.
Yes, absolutely. Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. New episodes published every Tuesday morning. Remember, next week we are taking a week off, but we will be back on July 16th. If you know someone that likes weather history, please share this episode with them. We'd also love you to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Huge thanks to Dr. Jon Nese for joining me on this episode. For the National Weather Desk, I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.